we're into Act 2, Scene 3. And this is that famous scene in which Edgar describes what's happened since he ran away, and in which he tells us that he's going to adopt the poor Tom persona. This is an unusual Shakespeare play, especially in terms of the tragedies, because it has multiple soliloquies, but none of them are spoken by Lear. This is, we know Edmund is somebody who speaks soliloquies. We know Cordelia has one particularly powerful one in Act 4. And this is Edgar's. Edgar has 2, and this is his best one. So it's the scene in which, again, sorry, I think I mentioned we're on page 27 of the paper 2 notes book. It's the scene in which it kind of sets, Shakespeare's using this scene to set up what comes later on. But the soliloquy is interesting, really, because not only does it tell us what's happened to Edgar and what Edgar plans to do, but it also gives us an image of what life in Lear's Britain is like. And it's a very interesting depiction. So again, your job, read that very short summary. My job, go through the key quotes. Now, I'm going to go through it stage by stage. I'm going to mark some things in green, which means they're interesting, some things in yellow, which means I highly recommend you learn them. You'll see them in the knowledge tests at the end of the video. So first of all, he says, I heard myself proclaimed, and by this happy hollow of a tree escaped the hunt. I'll make that a little bit bigger. So, I heard myself being outlawed, people saying, if you find Edgar, arrest him, he's to be killed. So he showed an ability to improvise and survive by finding a dead tree and climbing inside the tree, the hollow of the tree, and he survived. Now, what does he do? He tells us that the hunt he's aware is on for him. No port is free, no place that guard and most unusual vigilance does not attend my taking. So his father has locked down the region. He can't get to a boat to escape. He can't get away. He's under huge strain because he's being hunted. So, how does he survive? Whiles I may escape, I will preserve myself. Now, that's interesting. He says, I will preserve myself. And then he says, in other words, I will survive. So Edgar is a survivor. When we get to the end of the play, he is the guy that has shown the greatest resilience in the play. And that's something we admire in him. His first stage, he says, is to survive. So he says he's going to do this. Now, this is what gets important. He says, I am betaught to take the basest and most poorest shape that ever penury in contempt of man brought near to beast. Now, isn't it interesting that he's going to take it? So what he's saying is, he's going to disguise himself as a beggar. So penury is poverty. Base is down the very bottom. Now, it's interesting that Edmund was at the base and wanted to climb, and so he needed to knock Edgar out of his way. So now Edgar has to pretend to be at the base, be the lowest peasant or the lowest beggar that the land could see. So this idea of disguise, of pretending to be something you're not in order to achieve your goals, this is something that we see repeatedly in the play. He says, my face I'll grind with filth. So he's going to put dirt all over him. Blanket my loins. So he's going to essentially go naked except for like a covering over his midriff. Elf all my hair and knots. So he's going to make himself look crazy. And with presented nakedness outface the winds and persecutions of the sky. Now again, I really like that. So what he's choosing to do is suffer. And it's this idea in the play and it's a really important idea, of redemption through suffering. And Edgar is a part. Lear sins at the beginning, suffers terribly, and achieves some element of redemption at the end. Gloucester, exactly the same arc. Edgar, he's a good man, and yet he chooses to suffer, as if in a very, while the play is set in pre-Christian Britain, it was very much written in the cultural context of Shakespeare's, living in the early 1700s in Protestant Christian England and London. There's this idea of Edgar almost being like the kind of Christ-like figure who takes on suffering in order to bring redemption to the nation. Maybe I'm overcomplicating it, but he is so interesting. The bit you learn from this soliloquy, I like be taught to take the basis that most poor shape that ever penury in contempt of man brought near to beast. But the bit I really like, the bit that you learn, is this part. Their country gives me proof and precedent of bedlam beggars, who with roaring voices strike in their numbed and mortified bare arms pins, wooden pricks, nails, sprigs of rosemary. Now, let's get this clear. Bedlam is a reference to the Bethlehem Hospital in London, which was, for want of a better term, a lunatic asylum. And what Edgar is saying is, sure, there's people all over the place like this. Really poor people driven to madness. Really poor people who are completely exposed physically, psychologically, and suffering. Their suffering is mental as well as physical. They're described taking pins and stabbing themselves in the flesh with the pins, with wooden pricks, with nails, with taking rosemary, which has with thorns, and ripping their skin open with it. Now, this is a description of people suffering greatly with their mental health. And this is in Lear's kingdom. Lear, who was given the power of a king by the gods so that he would rule with justice and fairness. And this suffering has to at least be his responsibility. This suffering is indicative of, evidence of, his failure as a king. And the reason for that failure is because of his vanity. Because of his obsession with not the interests of the people he is duty bound to serve, but his own interests. And the reason I'm talking about this is because one of the most important stages in Lear's journey to self-realization, to humility in his transformation, occurs when he meets poor Tom, Edgar disguised as this terribly suffering, this man who suffers terribly. So that's what he's going to do. And with this horrible object from low farms, poor pelting villages, sheepcotes and mills, sometimes with lunatic bans, sometimes over prayers, enforce their charity. Poor Turligod, poor Tom. That's something yet. Edgar, I nothing am. So he's going to go and live off the land in extreme poverty in order to try to survive. And that is the soliloquy, which establishes Edgar as a man who is brave and resourceful, but who will become, I think Edgar's role in the play more than anything else is as a symbol of how when power is abused, good people suffer. He's a good man. He's living in a kingdom where the king has abdicated, unleashing chaos, and he's the son of a father who is impetuous and rash and is weak and malleable, and he's suffering because of it. So as a symbol of all of that, this is a really, really, really interesting speech. I think so. Maybe you don't.